Did you know that the idea of equivalent fractions dates back 3,000 years to ancient Egypt? In ancient Egypt, fractions were always represented as sums of unit fractions, and that simply means fractions that had 1 as a numerator. For example, instead of writing 3/4, they would express it as being 1/2 and 1/4. Now, this method set the groundwork for understanding that fractions can be manipulated and expressed differently, yet in equivalent ways. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to find equivalent fractions using methods that foster understanding rather than rules. But before we do that, let me share 3 reasons why your students or child should be able to find equivalent fractions. First, equivalent fractions can help reduce complex fractions into their simplest terms, which in turn helps the students gain a better understanding of a fraction's value. For example, it's very difficult to picture 12/16 in your head, but it's not so difficult to picture 3/4. Now, this is simply called simplifying fractions. And in order to do that, you must know your divisibility rules, which will help you find the highest common factor. Second, to add and subtract common fractions, we often need to find a common denominator. This involves converting both fractions into equivalent forms using the same denominator. For example, 1/2 plus 1/3 can easily be calculated when you convert them into sixths. 1/2 plus 1/3 has the same value as 3/6 plus 2/6, which is 5/6. And finally, finding common denominators is the most common strategy for comparing fractions that have different denominators. For example, which is greater, 2/3 or 3/4? Converting these to equivalent fractions makes it far easier for direct comparison. 2/3 is the same as 8/12, and 3/4 is the same as 9/12. So you can easily see that 9/12 is greater, therefore 3/4 is greater. Now, there are other strategies for comparing fractions too, but that's a topic for another episode. Now let's look at how to develop the skill of finding equivalent fractions. Using an area model such as this, you can have students colour part of the whole to show the first fraction, then divide the whole again with lines to reveal an equivalent fraction. What happened to the numerator and the denominator? By doing this several times, students can see a pattern occurring, which will help them develop the rule. This simple graphic summarizes the effect of using multiplication on both the numerator and denominator to find equivalent fractions. In fact, we can use a multiplication grid to find equivalent fractions very easily. Look at this typical multiplication grid that I showed in a previous episode that explored a strategy for multiplying by 5. This left-hand column shows one factor, and the top row shows the other factor. So 5 times 3, for example, is 15. But let's remove the column and the row that shows the 2 factors. Suppose we want to find all the equivalent fractions for 1/4. We simply remove the strip that shows the numerator, which is 1, and the strip that shows the denominator, which is 4, and we place them together like this. Now we can quickly see all the equivalent fractions for 1/4. But why does this work? Because as a multiplication grid, it shows all the multiples of 1 and 4. Now let's put some of this into action. By considering this problem, we can simplify each fraction by determining that the lowest common multiple is 24. And then we can express and solve our problem using 24ths as equivalent fractions. Alternatively, we could multiply both denominators to find an equivalent fraction and then simplify the answer which is a complex fraction. Now we can simplify that by dividing both the numerator and the denominator by 2, but then we'd have to divide again. It's far easier to look at it, find the highest common factor, which is 4, and then you can simplify that complex fraction in just one step. And this is what I want you to do. 1. Remember that equivalence is one of those big ideas in fractions that your students or child simply need to master. And knowing divisibility rules and being able to find the highest common factor and lowest common multiple are prerequisites to finding equivalent fractions. And 2, use the activity I provided you in the links to give your students or child a conceptual understanding of equivalent fractions. And 3, as they do that, help them see that multiplication can be used to describe the relationship between the numerators and the denominators. And finally, if you've seen value in this episode, leave a helpful comment or a thumbs up and subscribe today so you never miss another learning opportunity with me. See you next time.